She was 19 years old, and by every cold measure the world had placed upon her, she owned nothing but the dress on her back, a cracked leather satchel, and $11 folded inside a handkerchief her mother had embroidered with small blue flowers. With 10 of those dollars, she bought something that made 3 grown men laugh out loud at a county auction on a Tuesday morning in the autumn of 1897. What she purchased was a derelict United States Army fort, 47 acres of crumbling adobe walls, broken fencing, a collapsed stable, and a stone armory building that had been sealed shut since 1881. The federal government had sold it for unpaid county assessments, and every sensible person in Caldwell Flats, New Mexico Territory, had already decided there was nothing inside those walls but rats, rust, and the ghosts of soldiers nobody remembered. But sealed inside that armory, behind a door that had not opened in 16 years, was a secret so carefully buried that the man who had buried it had built an entire county fortune on top of it. And a girl that everyone had dismissed as a penniless wanderer with foolish ideas was about to pull it into the light. Settle in and let us tell you the story of Wren Calloway. If you have ever been underestimated by someone who should have known better, leave us a word in the comments below. Wren had not always been homeless. There had been a time not so long before that October auction when she had lived in a 2-room house on the edge of a working homestead outside of Taos, where her father, a quiet man named Thomas Calloway, had kept a small forge and repaired iron tools for neighboring ranchers. He had taught Wren to work iron before she was 12, not in a dramatic way, not with grand speeches about legacy and craft. He simply handed her the hammer one afternoon, positioned her elbow, and said, "Watch the color of the metal, not the flame. The color tells you everything." She had listened. She had always listened carefully to things other people overlooked. Her mother had died of fever when Wren was 8, leaving behind a small cedar box that held 3 needles, a spool of brown thread, and the handkerchief with the blue flowers. Her father had left behind the hammer, a ledger of debts owed to him that were never paid, and a piece of land that turned out to have been used as collateral on a loan Thomas Calloway had not fully understood when he signed the paper. That paper was what destroyed everything. The man who held the paper was named Aldous Ferris. He was not a dramatic villain in the way of dime novels. He did not sneer or shout. He was 51 years old, well-dressed in a brown wool suit, and he spoke in the precise, unhurried language of a man who had spent decades making the world feel as though its suffering was simply the natural consequence of arithmetic. He served simultaneously as the senior partner of the Ferris Land and Development Company, the largest private lender in 3 counties, and the unpaid but deeply influential advisor to the county commissioner, whose elections Ferris had quietly funded for 12 years. When Thomas Calloway died of a stroke in the spring of 1897, Ferris arrived at the homestead within a week. He brought a clerk, 2 documents, and the expression of a man performing a mildly distasteful but necessary errand. He explained to Wren, who had just turned 19 and had been alone for 11 days, that the land, the forge, the structure, and all contents therein had been pledged against a debt of $230 her father had borrowed 4 years prior. The interest, compounded as stated in the original agreement, now amounted to $312. The total balance was therefore $542, which the estate could not satisfy. The property would revert to the Ferris Land and Development Company within 30 days. He looked at her once, a brief, flat assessment, the way a man looks at a fence post to determine whether it is worth keeping or pulling out. He said she might keep personal clothing and small keepsakes of no monetary value. He said it gently, even kindly, in the tone of a man granting a generous concession. He left. His clerk left. The documents stayed on the table. Wren sat at that table for a long time after they were gone. She did not cry immediately. She read the documents 3 times because her father had taught her to read carefully and to look for the number that does not quite match the one before it. She found 2. The interest rate listed in the original agreement was 6% annually. The rate Ferris had applied was 9%, described in smaller print on the second page as the default rate, activated, according to the document, after a missed payment in December of 1894. She had no way of proving the December payment had been made. There was no receipt. She suspected her father had paid in person and received no written acknowledgement, because Thomas Calloway had trusted people the way most honest men of his generation did, which was too completely and too quietly. She packed her satchel. She took her father's hammer, which fit in the satchel if she angled the head toward the left corner. She took the cedar box with the needles and the handkerchief. She took the ledger of debts owed to her father, even though most of those debts were years old. She took $11 that she found in a coffee tin under the forge, and she walked to the road. She rode a mail wagon to Taos, then a southbound train to a junction town. Then another train toward a place she had heard mentioned once by a ranch hand who passed through her father's forge the previous winter. He had mentioned Caldwell Flats. He had said it was a town that used to be something and was now mostly not. He had said the old Army fort on the eastern edge of it had been empty since the Army gave it up, and that a person could probably sleep in its shadow without anyone bothering them, because nobody bothered with Caldwell Flats anymore. She arrived on the 3rd of October. The train set her down at a siding where the platform was warped and the signpost leaned 15 degrees to the left. The town was 5 blocks of buildings, roughly half of them occupied, and a main road that turned to deep dust in the dry season and, as she would soon learn, to ankle-deep mud in the wet one. There was a general store, a boarding house run by a woman named Cora Bledsoe, a farrier's shop with no farrier currently in it, a small county office, and a saloon that served as the town's primary gathering place, news exchange, and unofficial court of public opinion. The fort was visible from the road. It sat a quarter-mile east of the last building in town, ringed by a low adobe wall that had crumbled in long sections, exposing the interior grounds to whatever wind chose to visit. From the road it looked like a set of bones left in the sun. The stable had partially collapsed. The main barracks building had lost its roof at the eastern end. The parade ground inside the walls was overgrown with dry grass and a few stubborn desert plants that seemed to take pride in surviving where nothing else would. The armory stood apart from the other structures. It was built of stone rather than adobe, a squat, thick-walled building roughly the size of a generous barn with a single iron door on its southern face. The door was secured with a padlock the size of a man's fist, the shackle of which had been corroded into a single dark mass of rust and old iron that looked as though it had not moved since the year Garfield was shot. The auction happened the morning after she arrived. She had slept in the loft of Cora Bledsoe's boarding house in exchange for helping Cora carry water from the pump and scrub 3 pots that had needed scrubbing for some time. The county was auctioning 17 properties for unpaid assessments, most of them small lots and 1 abandoned building. The fort came up last, which meant the 3 dozen people present had grown bored, cold, and mildly contemptuous by the time it was announced. The auctioneer, a thin man named Purdy with a voice like a gate in the wind, described the property as 47 acres inclusive of existing structures in their present condition. He paused on the phrase "in their present condition" in the way that people pause on words they intend as warnings. He noted that the federal government had made no representation as to the condition of the armory door or its contents, and that the buyer accepted all structures and any contents as found. He asked for an opening bid of $20. Nobody moved. He asked for $15. A man in the back made a comment about not paying for the privilege of cleaning up someone else's problem. 2 other men chuckled. Wren raised her hand and said $10. Purdy looked at her the way men in that era looked at young women who spoke at auctions, which is to say he looked confused first, then amused, then practiced about appearing neutral. He asked if she was representing a buyer. She said she was the buyer. He asked if she understood the property was 47 acres of deteriorated military construction. She said she understood. He asked if anyone would offer more. Nobody offered more. He brought the gavel down. Someone behind her said, low enough that she could still hear it clearly, "Well, there goes $10 to the wind." She signed the transfer documents in the county clerk's office that afternoon and received a deed that listed her name, Wren Agnes Calloway. As the fee simple owner of the former Fort Reardon Military Reservation, Caldwell Flats, New Mexico Territory. She folded the deed and placed it in the cedar box beside the needles and the handkerchief. She had $1 left. The first week at the fort was not a story of courage so much as a story of stubbornness and basic calculation. The barracks roof that remained intact covered 2 rooms she could use. She cleared the debris with the blade of her father's hammer, a broken wagon spoke she found in the collapsed stable, and her hands. She found a hand pump in the courtyard that, after 40 minutes of priming with water, she carried in a tin pail from a shallow creek 100 yards north. Produced a stream of cold, clean water that tasted like iron and relief. She found 3 intact iron stoves in the barracks and spent most of a morning learning which one would draw properly. Cleaning the flue pipe of 17 years of bird nests and soot until smoke rose correctly through the chimney and the room began to hold warmth. She did not approach the armory door on the first day or the second. She was too busy surviving, but she looked at it every morning and every evening. She noted the size of the padlock shackle. She noted the hinges of the door, which were iron and exposed and which faced outward, which struck her as an odd way to hang a door meant to keep things in. She noted on the third day a set of faint marks carved into the stone above the doorframe, not decorative but precise, the kind of marks a careful person makes to remember something. Not the kind a soldier makes out of boredom. The marks looked like a combination of a surveyor's symbol and something else she could not immediately name. She asked Cora Bledsoe about the fort's history one evening when she came to the boarding house to trade a small piece of ironwork she had fashioned from a bent bracket she found in the stable. A simple hook that Cora needed for her kitchen wall. Cora was a broad-shouldered woman in her mid-50s who had survived a husband, a drought, and a cholera year with equal practicality, and who had initially regarded Wren with the cautious skepticism that frontier women reserved for anyone who might become a burden. But she watched Wren work and she noted the hook was straight and well finished, and she poured Wren a second cup of coffee and talked. The fort had been active until 1881, Cora said. It had served as a supply depot and paymaster station for 2 cavalry units working the Southern Territory. The Army had closed it when the regional command was consolidated elsewhere. The commander at the time of closing had been a man named Captain Elias Drummond, who had a reputation for precision in his records. When the fort was decommissioned, Cora said there was talk that not everything had been properly accounted for. She did not know exactly what that meant. She said the man who had handled the decommissioning paperwork on behalf of the county, who had served as the civilian liaison between the Army and the territorial government in that year, was a younger man at the time, just beginning his career in land development. Wren asked his name. Cora poured herself a second cup and looked at the table for a moment before answering. She said, "Aldous Ferris." Wren set down her cup very carefully. She said, "I see." She did not sleep well that night, but she thought clearly, which was sometimes more useful than sleep. The armory door defeated her for 8 days. This is not a failure worth glossing over, because those 8 days are part of the story. The padlock was beyond salvage, the rust having fused the mechanism into something that was now simply a lump of iron attached to a hasp. And no amount of oil or persuasion was going to open it by its original design. She worked instead on the hinges, which were large iron pintles set into lead sleeves in the stone frame. She removed the lead sleeves one by one, using a narrow cold chisel she fashioned from a piece of wagon axle she found in the stable and tempered in her stove, and a hammer that rang across the quiet desert morning with a sound so clean and regular that an old man named Eustace Webb, who had been the fort's civilian maintenance worker in its last 3 years of operation and who still lived in a small cabin half a mile north, walked over on the 5th morning to find out who was doing ironwork at a decommissioned Army fort. Eustace was 68 years old, wiry and suspicious in the particular way of men who have been correct about most of their suspicions. He stood at the wall and watched her work without speaking for approximately 4 minutes. Then he said that the hinge on the left side had an extra securing pin set 2 inches below the visible one, hidden in the stone, and that she would need to remove it before the door would move even with the pintles out. Because Captain Drummond had added it after a break-in attempt in 1879 and had not included it in the fort's standard maintenance records. She stopped work and looked at him. He shrugged and said Captain Drummond was a careful man. She asked how Eustace knew about the hidden pin. He said because he was the one who had drilled the hole for it. He stayed. Not all at once, not with any announcement, but in the incremental way that practical people form alliances. He simply came back each morning and contributed what he knew. And she contributed what she could work with, and between them they dismantled the problem one layer at a time. On the 8th day, with both hinge pintles removed, the hidden pin extracted, and the hasp plate pulled from the frame with a crowbar, the iron door of the armory of Fort Reardon swung outward for the first time in 16 years, releasing a rush of cool, still air that smelled of cedar oil, old paper, and something metallic and dry. The smell of things carefully stored. The interior of the armory was dark. Wren stood in the doorway with a lantern held high. The room was approximately 30 feet wide and 40 feet deep, with stone walls 3 feet thick and a ceiling of heavy timber beams still intact. Along the left wall were empty wooden racks where rifles had once been stored. Along the right wall were shelves. And on the shelves, arranged with the meticulous order of a man who believed in the moral authority of documentation, were cedar-lined document boxes, 12 of them, each labeled in neat block letters, each sealed with wax that had dried to a dark amber and still held. Below the shelves, bolted to the floor, was a military-issue strongbox, roughly the size of a steamer trunk, painted army green with a combination lock on its face. Eustace, standing behind her, was quiet for a moment. Then he said, in a voice so low it was almost to himself, "Drummond didn't leave empty-handed after all." Wren walked to the nearest document box and read its label. It said, Payroll LEDGERS Fort REARDON Garrison 1878-1881 Civilian Labor Accounts Final Audit Disputed. The word disputed had been underlined twice in a different hand from the block letters with a pen pressed hard enough to score the cedar. She opened the box. Inside, preserved by the cedar lining and the sealed air, were ledger pages, carbon copies of payment orders, signed receipts, and a sealed envelope addressed in a careful script to the United States Inspector General's Office, Department of the Army, Washington, D.C. The envelope had never been sent. Tucked beneath it was a single folded sheet of paper in the same hand as the underlined word on the box. She read it standing up with the lantern in one hand. It was dated December 14, 1881. It was signed by Captain Elias Drummond, U.S. Army, retired by order. It said in plain and careful language that in the final accounting of the Fort Reardon decommissioning, a sum of $11,240 in civilian labor wages for the years 1879, 1880, and 1881 had been approved by the Army paymaster and physically delivered in currency to the civilian liaison officer designated by the territorial government, whose name and signature appeared on the attached receipt for distribution to the workers. The workers had never received those wages. He had attempted to report this through official channels and had been informed that the civilian liaison had certified the payments as distributed. Drummond had preserved his copies of every document. He had sealed them here because he did not trust anyone in the county to hold them safely, and he had been unable to travel to Washington in his deteriorating health. He had hoped someone would eventually open the door. The name on the distribution receipt was Aldous Ferris, aged 26 at the time, representing the Ferris Land and Development Company, which had been founded the following spring. Wren read the letter a second time. She read it a third time. Then she folded it carefully, set it back in the box, and sat down on the stone floor of the armory with her back against the cold wall and her father's hammer across her knees. And she let herself feel the full weight of what she had just found, not the money, not the triumph, but the faces behind it, the men and women who had done the work and walked away with nothing, who had perhaps told their families the army cheated them and been disbelieved, whose children had grown up in houses that could have had better roofs, whose wives had stretched smaller provisions over longer winters. Eustace stood in the doorway and did not speak. After a while she said, "How many civilian workers were at the fort in those last 3 years?" he thought. He said somewhere between 60 and 80 at the height of it, mostly local men, Mexican families, some Apache, a few Anglo settlers, people who needed work and took what the army offered. She asked if any of them were still in the area. He said some, their children anyway, their grandchildren. She said, "Good." She spent the next 3 days reading every document in every box, making notes in a ledger she purchased on credit from the general store after explaining to its owner, a stout and cautious man named Hargrove, that she had found something that would eventually matter to this town. Hargrove looked at her with the expression of a man who wanted to believe her and was fighting his better financial judgment. He gave her the ledger on credit. The strongbox required the attention of a locksmith who traveled the circuit between 3 county towns and who arrived in Caldwell Flats on the second Thursday of November. He spent 3 hours on the combination mechanism and charged her $1.50 she borrowed from Cora against a promise of continued ironwork. Inside the strongbox was a second set of documents, these ones original Army paymaster orders rather than copies, bearing seals and signatures that the carbon copies merely reproduced. Also inside were 67 silver dollars and a note from Drummond that said simply, "For expenses of justice should the right person find this." She counted the silver dollars twice. She put them back. She was not ready to move yet. She understood with the quiet strategic intelligence of a person who has been dismissed by powerful men and has thought carefully about what that means, that walking into a county office with a box of papers and the name Aldous Ferris would not produce justice. It would produce lawyers, delays, and a quiet conversation between Ferris and whatever official she spoke to first, followed by her documents being characterized as incomplete, misunderstood, or fraudulent. Ferris had had 30 years to build the architecture of his authority in this county. She had been a landowner for 6 weeks. She needed allies who could not be dismissed. She needed the story to travel through channels Ferris did not control before he had the chance to seal them. She wrote a letter to the United States Inspector General's Office, Department of the Army, enclosing a full accounting of what she had found and certified copies she made by hand of the key documents, including Drummond's letter and Ferris's distribution receipt. She sent it from the county seat by registered mail, carried personally by Eustace, who had once served as a contract mail carrier and knew the postmaster in 3 towns. She wrote a second letter to the territorial newspaper in Santa Fe, addressed to its editor, with the same materials attached and a note saying she would provide original documents for inspection at any time the paper cared to send a correspondent. She wrote a third letter to a lawyer in Albuquerque whose name she found in a 2-year-old territorial legal directory she discovered in the county office among materials nobody had organized since 1893. His name was Martin Acevedo. She did not know if he was still practicing. She explained the situation with precision, listed the documents she held, and asked whether he would be willing to represent the interests of the workers' surviving families on a contingency arrangement. Then she continued working on the fort. This was not patience for its own sake. It was the understanding that a restored building speaks differently than a claim. An occupied property commands different attention than a ruin. She patched the barracks roof with salvaged timber she purchased from a collapsed structure at the edge of town whose owner, a man named Greer who had moved to Colorado 3 years prior, was delighted to receive $2 for materials he had forgotten he owned. She repaired the forge that sat in the blacksmith shed attached to the main barracks. She began taking in small iron repair jobs from ranchers in the area, whose business she earned slowly and by reputation. Because the work was good and the price was honest and word of both travels in small places. Cora Bledsoe began sending her boarders who needed mending done. A sideline wren managed in the evenings with the needles from the cedar box, sitting by the stove in the barracks with her mother's handkerchief smoothed across her knee as a kind of talisman of concentration. By December, the armory was clean and the document boxes were stored in careful order on the shelves, each one now catalogued in Wren's ledger with a description of contents, document dates, and relevant names. She had also opened and read every piece of paper in those boxes, including payroll records for individual workers, some of whom were listed by name. And she had cross-referenced those names against what Eustace could remember and what the county recorder's books, which were public documents she spent 2 days reading at the county office, could confirm about property ownership, tax filings, and death certificates in the region. She found 41 families she could connect to named workers on the Fort Reardon civilian payroll. 22 of those families still had members living within 50 miles. Martin Acevedo wrote back in January he was still practicing. He had read her letter 4 times and then read it again. He said the documents she described, if they were as she described them, represented one of the more clearly documented cases of civil contract fraud he had encountered in 20 years of territorial law. He said he would come to Caldwell Flats in March. The territorial newspaper's correspondent arrived in February. A young man named Pease who wore spectacles and carried a camera and was clearly not expecting to find a 19-year-old woman running an ironworks out of a rehabilitated Army fort. He stayed 4 days, read every document she showed him, interviewed Eustace, interviewed Cora, and rode out to speak with 2 of the families on her list. An elderly woman named Flores whose father had worked at the fort as a carpenter and who had spent decades believing her father's claim of unpaid wages was a confused old man's grievance. And a middle-aged rancher named Archuleta whose grandfather's name appeared 7 times in the payroll ledger as a skilled mason. The correspondent asked Wren how she had found the armory. She told him. He asked what she intended to do with it. She said she intended to use it as a place where accurate records were kept and honest work was done, and that if this county was eventually willing to treat it as such, she would make it available to that purpose. He wrote the story carefully. It appeared in the Santa Fe paper on the 15th of March under the headline, Sealed Armory YIELDS Proof of 30-Year Wage Fraud, Fort REARDON Documents Implicate County Land Developer. It covered 4 columns. It included a photograph of Wren standing at the open armory door with the iron door visible behind her. Aldous Ferris read the article in his office. He then had a conversation with his attorney, who advised him that the original Army documents bearing genuine federal seals were not something that could be easily characterized as forgeries. He then had a conversation with his banker in Albuquerque, who expressed concern about several outstanding land notes. He then discovered that the Inspector General's office had received Wren's letter in November and had quietly opened a federal inquiry in January. The inquiry did not move dramatically. Federal inquiries seldom do, but they move, and the fact of their movement is enough to make creditors cautious and partners reconsider their arrangements. 2 of Ferris's largest development partners in Colorado Territory wrote him polite letters in April expressing that they were reassessing their positions in light of changed circumstances. His application for a new county assessment contract was quietly declined by the commissioner, who had recently been made aware that the federal inquiry existed and that his own name appeared in one of the Fort Reardon documents as having co-signed a 1884 letter confirming that the Ferris Company had properly discharged all obligations related to the decommissioning. The commissioner found himself suddenly very busy with other matters. Martin Acevedo arrived in March as promised, a compact, serious man in his late 40s who shook Wren's hand without ceremony and then spent 6 hours in the armory reading documents. He filed suit in federal court on behalf of 11 surviving family members of named payroll workers, seeking the original wages plus 30 years of statutory interest, calculated from the original default date. The math was not comfortable for the defendant. The settlement came in August after Ferris's second attorney advised him, with the bluntness of a man who has run out of alternatives, that the original distribution receipt bearing his own signature was decisive and that no court in the territory would look on the defense favorably. The federal judgment required the distribution of a sum that, after legal costs, amounted to a little over $8,000, divided among the established families according to the original payroll records Wren had catalogued. It was not a fortune for anyone, But it was wages that should have been paid in 1881 and had been stolen instead, and the giving of them back, even 30 years late, even in the form of a banker's draft rather than silver, carried a different weight than money ordinarily does. The Flores family repaired a roof. The Archuleta family bought 2 mules and a seed drill and put 40 acres under cultivation in the spring. 3 other families paid off small debts that had been compressing their lives for years. One older woman, a widow named Santos, whose husband had been listed in the payroll records as a teamster at Fort Reardon, received her share and did not say anything for a long time, and then said only that she had always known her husband was not lying. Aldous Ferris sold his primary holdings in Caldwell Flats the following spring at a price considerably below what they had represented 2 years earlier. He relocated to Tucson, where he had cousins. The county did not see him again. His name remained on the assessment records for several years before a new commissioner had them corrected. The Ferris Land and Development Company was formally dissolved by the territorial courts in 1901 when it could not satisfy its creditors. Nobody in Caldwell Flats held a celebration over any of this. That is not the way such things resolve themselves in small places. What happened instead was quieter and more durable. The general store began delivering to families in the surrounding area again, because several of those families had money for accounts. The farrier's shop at the edge of town reopened, operated by a young man named Tio Archuleta, who was 22 and had spent 2 years apprenticed to a blacksmith in Las Cruces. Wren helped him set up the forge. She lent him one of the spare anvils she had found stored in the Armory's back room beneath a canvas tarpaulin that had preserved it almost perfectly. She charged him nothing for the anvil and said only that she expected him to do straight work at fair prices, and he said that was his intention. Cora Bledsoe repainted the boarding house in the fall of 1899. She charged Wren nothing for a room after that, though Wren continued to pay in ironwork and mending, and an arrangement that was never formally named but was understood by both parties to be a partnership of the practical and lasting kind. The schoolhouse at the south end of Caldwell Flats had been closed for 4 years for lack of funds and a teacher. In the winter of 1900, a woman named Adela Vega, who had been teaching in Albuquerque and who had read the newspaper story about Fort Reardon and written Wren a letter she had not entirely expected to receive a reply to, arrived in town. She had a certificate from the Territorial Board of Education and a trunk of books. She asked whether the schoolhouse could be made usable. Wren inspected it, calculated the cost of necessary repairs in the lumber and iron she had on hand, and said it could be made usable by spring. It was made usable by April. School opened in May with 14 students, which was more than anyone had expected, and the sound of children in that building on a weekday morning was, according to Eustace, the first sign in some years that the town had decided to continue. The Armory itself became something that had no single name. Wren used it as her office and record room, which she made available to any person in the county who needed documents stored, copied, or witnessed, without charge. She kept the cedar boxes of the Fort Reardon payroll records in their proper place on the shelves, clean and cataloged, because she believed that the record of what had happened deserved a permanent home and that she was, for the moment, its appropriate keeper. The strongbox remained bolted to the floor and unlocked, its interior containing only Drummond's 67 silver dollars and his note, which Wren had placed in a small cedar frame she made herself and hung above the shelf. She had considered what to do with the silver dollars for some time before deciding. She converted them to currency and established a small community fund administered by 3 residents of the town, of whom she was not one, for the purpose of making small loans at no interest to persons who needed tools, seed, or materials to begin a trade or repair a property. It was a modest thing. It helped 8 families in the first 2 years. It continued after that. She was 22 years old by the time most of this was settled. She did not think of herself as a person who had done something extraordinary. She thought of herself as a person who had read the documents carefully, which was what her father had always told her to do, and who had opened a door that someone had sealed for the wrong reasons. which was simply the right thing to do when you found a door like that. On a morning in early November of 1900, she stood in the open doorway of the Armory in the first light. With the desert air cold and clean around her and the smoke from the barrack stove rising straight up into a sky that was the particular deep blue of autumn mornings in the high desert. She could hear faintly the sound of Tio Archuleta's hammer from the farrier shop in town, beginning his morning work with the steady rhythm of iron on iron. She could hear even more faintly the sound of the school bell, which Adela rang at 8 o'clock without fail. She held her father's hammer loosely at her side, its handle worn smooth in exactly the places where her hand fell naturally, as though it had been fitted to her gradually over the years, which, in a way, it had been. The deed to Fort Reardon was in the cedar box, beside her mother's handkerchief and the needles. The cedar box sat on the shelf inside the Armory between the first and second document boxes of the Fort Reardon payroll records, in the exact spot she had chosen for it on the day she arranged the room. Because it seemed right that her document of ownership should keep company with the documents of people who had earned something and been denied it, and who had been remembered at last. She turned back inside and set her father's hammer on the desk beside her open ledger. She had work to do. There is something the world consistently fails to learn, though the evidence for it appears with reliable frequency in places most people have stopped looking. The things that are dismissed, sealed away, sold for almost nothing, and left to weather at the edge of a town's attention have a way of outlasting the confidence of the people who dismissed them. The value was always there. The question was only who would be patient enough and honest enough and stubborn enough to open the door. Wren Calloway was 19 years old when she bought a forgotten fort for $10, and the world laughed at her because it did not know what she knew, which was that her father had taught her to read the color of the metal and not the flame, and that the right thing sealed under enough pressure eventually speaks for itself, provided someone is willing to do the work of listening. Thank you for spending this time with us and with Wren's story. If it moved something in you, consider sharing it with someone who has ever been handed a door the world said wasn't worth opening. And for our question today, we would very much like to hear from you. Have you ever found real value in something that everyone around you had already written off? The comments are open and we read every one of them. Until we meet again for the next story, hold on to the things others overlook. Sometimes that is exactly where the truth is waiting.